try and bring this down to a local community level, and imagine if you live opposite the allotments and you want to do something about it. The question is, so what? What can you do? And so I'm just going to try and quickly catch up on what has been happening in the area of property level protection and what has been learnt over the last 4 or 5 years. The background, the practice, the importance of assessing all sources of flooding, not just, let's say, the main river, and you can go and fit and forget your door on the property, and then of course groundwater will come up through the floors. So the definition of groundwater, as we just heard, is important, and the understanding of what that is and how it emerges at the surface, the implications for the resident and the community. So as we've seen last winter, yet another massive period of flooding with huge insurance claims. Again though, often you see pretty ineffective tools, bits of plywood and stone and really good old sandbag. We saw, I was going to call this plug in the gap, but then I thought the emergency services are doing that. So we saw sandbags being delivered by the army into flooded doorways, which really questions the sensibility, but it captures the fact that you need to be doing something. And if we in our house feel impotent, you've really got to do something. What we really need is some useful tools. But for years, centuries, we've had sandbags. Sometimes we've had bits of plywood and plastic. This is an interesting one. This is a wheelie bin barrier. I'm not sure what day the dustmen come, but that'll be a problem. This is in Oxford. This captures the plea for help. And right as it's just about to come over the top, help. Now that really does capture the need for, we really have a responsibility to provide some better tools, and they are available. But for years we've had this gap. You had the Rolls Royce at the top, and then you've had sandbags or do nothing at the bottom. And for good reasons, cost benefit, clearly you cannot afford to provide flood defence schemes right across the country. But unfortunately, this is the image that you still so often see, and the desperation of that, if that is your home, not only has it happened once, and let's hope you recover and you go through the pain of the insurance, it's going to happen again and again. This was a property, bottom left, they just fitted a brand new kitchen, about £40,000, 3 weeks before the flood. There was a lot of groundwater flooding here, but it was combined with fluvial and sewage. This family move in next Friday. They've been out for 2 years. Huge impact. But thankfully we've got these new tools. We've got temporary flood barriers and we've got property level protection. So I'm just going to talk about those two, but both, if you like, separate out the sources, and they tend to identify where there is a groundwater issue, and they will also often tend to highlight where there's a sewage issue. In the past, it's all merged into one, and of course it's just the river, but that's not the case. I was flood manager on the Severn for many years in Shrewsbury. A heavy dew in Wales and Shrewsbury would flood, and really challenging, as it was in Ironbridge, Bewdley, and onwards to Worcester. So in 2003, we got DEFRA funding to put temporary barrier trials together, using geodesign in this instance. It's probably the most challenging site you could ever imagine, Ironbridge, in terms of will this work or won't it. It was the first use in the UK. And the residents they flood one-on-one, typically. So it was a useful site to pilot and trial. And sure enough, a year later, we got, in 2004, a very big flood, and it proved just how beneficial the temporary barriers can be. What it also showed is how groundwater interacts with the river, and the pumps that we had were in the gullies and also in basements of kitchens. Most people were saying, well, actually, it was brilliant. We just had 2 inches of clear water, and then we were back in our home a few days later. What there were real issues around is the emergency plan and the preparedness, and the fact that people were best not sitting down behind the barrier watching TV. They need to be upstairs or preferably out of the place. Before we look at property level protection, a bit more on the temporary barriers, which I think have a really key role to play in community defence as well. and they separate the flood away from the property to a degree. The barriers that you probably remember didn't make Upton were diverted down and protected Walham substation and saved the day. It would have been an evacuation of Gloucester and Cheltenham had they not been there. So in terms of property level protection, quickly whiz through the general methods that you've got, either to resist the water, try and limit the ingress, or through either manual or automatic measures, or indeed resilience measures, let the water in and try and adapt, be it through floor coverings, electrics, etc. Since 2003, when the kite mark scheme was launched, the product market has developed, and it's developed in stages as and when a flood has happened, and Making Space for Water was a good initiative to rejuvenate, as it was after the pit review. This is the test tank at Wallingford. So products come to market and they're tested, and if they meet the spec, after 2 or 3 weeks of testing and throwing water and waves at them, they will get a BSI kite mark. So it gives you some confidence that they will at least help limit ingress on the openings, but that's only half the story because of the floors and the walls. So as we've seen, huge reliance on sandbags, largely ineffective. 2007 flooding acted as another spur for more effort in this case. Michael Pitt called for a range of measures, and it led on to DEFRA running 2 years of pilots for property level protection. And JBA evaluated the 2-year scheme. 63 schemes, over 1,100 properties were included, and we gathered a lot of information from people, and it certainly did create demonstrated areas for promoting the benefits. It stimulated the supply of high quality survey, and it certainly encouraged the development of new products. There were very challenging timescales, but it was a pilot to try and have those objectives. Nevertheless, PLP awareness remains low, and interestingly, the confidence in these new systems, you still can't, even when you have new measures, you're putting sandbags in front of them, which is interesting. I'm sure these slides will be circulated later, so you won't read that, but it just captures a lot of the thoughts that you've got to go through in planning any property level protection scheme, or indeed a temporary barrier scheme, and including in there is the flood source. But it is simplified down to 4 stages. You appraise all the flood sources, carry out the survey of the property, sort your products and install, and aftercare. And that's just the start. That's when the emergency plan and the community engagement needs to come together so people know what is what. We'll skip through some of these. However, some of the evidence coming out of those early pilots, a lot of people just didn't know about property level protection and still don't. Many think it's the government's job, it's not their responsibility. Some were willing to pay but need the guidance. Big issue about blight, a real concern about that. But most importantly, the products that are deployed have got to be easy to use and quick and suitable for the person. And as I'm over 80 and disabled, this lady said, how am I going to assemble these products? So quite a key issue there. So I'm just going to talk quickly about the process, but I want to then just talk about how groundwater has become quite an issue and important to manage. The community event is vital because that's the first stage to actually gain awareness. Really manage expectations, raise awareness as to what this is achieving and why property level protection is being considered rather than a flood defence scheme that a lot of people would obviously really prefer, I suppose. Get the engagement, get the sign up, carry out the survey, understand where the points of ingress and the risk sources are, and provide an independent report for homeowners. That's going to need to look at flood sources. It's going to look at a range of options that are appropriate. It's going to look at levels, flood levels in 600 and 900 mil, and If you go much above 900, you're talking serious weights and pressures against properties that are effectively no longer supported by flood water on the other side. But a lot of what has been found from the pilot reviews is don't forget groundwater. It's very easy to just look at the openings and deal with the air bricks. But the nature of the floor, often buried anyway under tiles or carpet, people just don't really appreciate that. They may well know where the water emerges, where it hangs around. So a vital element is to consider how floodwater has behaved in the past and come up through floors. Part of the survey is to look at the flood risk. The second part, by a product installer, is to come and then provide the detailed measurements for the range of products. And it is a range of products, including pumps. If an individual looking on the internet is to try and find out more about this, they may find companies offering surveys, but they're often linked to a specific manufacturer. So there's an issue around independence and also knowledge about flood risk and hydrogeology. We also found that, not surprisingly, people want to choose the type of products and that it's suitable for their house. However, if you do go into the internet, you can find a range of suppliers offering the survey, including wefloodproofanyhouse.com, which is always not the best way to manage expectations, but a 2-day course. BPEC, actually, this is a very good initiative for improving the quality of product installation. That's excellent. The issue is the individual struggling to understand, and maybe with their repair and renew grant that they had from last winter, they're really going to struggle to know, where can I get this guidance? What exactly is it? And fitting and forgetting a flood door suggests that you've sorted it. You've prevented the flooding. And that's really the role of the independent surveyor, really, to work with the community and the local authority and the Environment Agency to really just run through the whole process and make people aware of the whole range of risks and then how to manage those risks into the future. So as you can see here, it's not just any surveying. And there's a vast amount of data needed, particularly around geology, particularly around soils, groundwater vulnerability, and not to focus just on what we know as aquifers. This is groundwater emerging through soils, subsoils, gravels, clays even. It's water that is coming up through the ground. So there is an issue around definition, but I think as long as everyone's clear, example of a report, product selection, but product handover. So the barriers are the obvious examples, that's fine. Spares and maintenance, non-return valves in the sewers to try and stop backflow. Carrying out tests in situ to give confidence to homeowners, and then the most important part, the community coming together and forming an emergency plan. And here's an exercise that we were involved in running with a dummy flood warning at night, and residents were deploying their measures. But that needs to include all the measures. But interestingly, after 2 or 3 years of pilot schemes, it didn't really rain, and so whilst it was fascinating and it was all very hopeful, where was the evidence? And rather like Ironbridge, residents were perversely thinking, we really need a flood to just see what we can expect. 2012 provided that opportunity, during which time around 84% of the products that had to be deployed actually had a beneficial effect. And it's good to see some evidence, including the dogs looking out there, as to some of these systems will work. They won't stop the flooding. Managing expectation is critical, including, notice, the pump running in a sump in the garden. But more and more evidence of these barriers and systems, the whole package of measures working as a system, which is good to see. But in terms of water coming up through the floor, this is really one of the key things that has been learnt, and it brings into the play homeowners' desire for fixtures and fittings, really. It's whether or not you're going to incorporate resilient design and ceramic flooring, for example, rather than carpets, because virtually every package of measure needs to include either a puddle sucker pump, if it's portable and it's just appearing and it's shallow, or indeed create sumps and collecting points and large capacity pumps. Here is an example of one such sump fitted into a concrete floor. The whole floor has been tiled and grades down to, and people can sweep into that sump and it pumps out through the pipework there. It's obviously got to be in combination with barriers and doors, so it is a whole package of measure. The real problem is, how do you predict? And I don't think you can predict and quantify the capacity. It's really through practical experience. But we're looking at these sorts of sump pumps at 500 to 600 litres a minute. If you go much higher than that, you're into three-phase electricity, so you're really beyond the homeowner's ability. The portable electric pumps are going to be 50, 100 to 150 litres a minute. But of course you can deploy more and more of those. It does raise issues that you've got to be there, you've got to be able, and you need power. Another example of a collecting sump into concrete floor, again linked to resilient flooring and discharging out barriers at the doorway. So a complete system. And I think this is a tale that really captures what one can expect or should expect. And this family experienced a dreadful flood in 2000, had that nightmare of 2 years out. But as you see there, we didn't aim to make it perfectly dry. It was just to keep the water down to 1 or 2 inches. And it was the best flood I've ever had. And largely the reason for that is, and don't forget the barriers themselves will leak. The kite mark allows a leakage rate. It's clearly going to come through the floors and the walls. But with the sump pump in place, it was able to keep up, and in this instance, the capacity of that pump was also adequate. But it is a problem in terms of specifying how many pumps, what size pumps, and it really will be through practice and procedure. One more last example of a large sump pump. Just summarising, manage expectations. This isn't about preventing flooding. It never is, but more so as you come down the pyramid, you're looking at sandbags plus. Deal with all the sources, particularly groundwater, and pumps got to be absolutely key. We have seen examples where both timber floorboards have burst under the hydraulic pressure, and indeed concrete floors have ruptured. Feedback, as I said, well, 3 out of 4 properties where the measures were deployed in 2012 were successfully mitigating that flood risk. So that's good news, but there's always issues around learning points, and that's led to some best practice guidance, and there's some summaries on the coffee table in their background there, work we did for DEFRA. So I'll just wind up with a summary of some of the learning points, particularly again, pumps still left in their boxes unopened. Some even had no plugs, and even others had no discharge hoses. So you need an emergency plan, you need a community test, you need dry runs, you need to be prepared. It could be, as we saw, even 20 years it could be before you need them, but it certainly could be 3 or 4 years. So you need an annual MOT and a check and a test. Some people have lost nuts and bolts. A lot of the seals on the measures have been eaten by rodents, so a whole area of maintenance and storage vital here. And just to sort of end up, really, it's all about combining the person, the property and the flood, and providing the community with much needed assistance, but managing that expectation really, and groundwater is a vital component of that. So I'll leave it at that.